Hello again, I'm Stephen Wells, the host of the Motoring Weekly podcast for the Australian Historic Road and Racing community. This is episode 168. Now, it's been a few weeks since the last episode, as I managed to get a winter chest infection that meant any interviews I recorded would have lots of sections cut out with all the coughing and wheezing. Plus, I've had two of my fleet off the road waiting for parts from Europe, and one is a late model vehicle where I expected parts to be available in Australia, but sadly not, and this has reduced my ability to travel somewhat. But let's get back to some more interesting content. This is another interview from the volunteers of the Australian Motor Heritage Foundation. I first met them late last year and published an overview in episode 123. The foundation considers itself a mini Smithsonian for the Australian automotive industry, including motorsport and motorcycles. They even have a small collection of aviation materials. In episodes 147, 157, 166 and 167, I covered the vast magazine collection, the race programs and the race results, and audio-visual content. Now, I recorded this interview earlier in the year out at Sydney Motorsport Park when I met with Geoff Piggott, the Chief Operating Officer. One of the more important topics we discussed was the Foundation's EVS, not eclectic vehicles or even electric vehicles, but an economic value study of the historic car community, which is an analysis of the importance to the economy of historic vehicles. And judging by the amount I'm pouring into my cars, I think I'm propping up a few businesses as well. So here's the chat with Geoff. I'm back at the Australian Motor Heritage Foundation, this time with Geoff Piggott. Now, Geoff, the last time I saw you was at One Raceway for an HSRCA day, and you kindly did an interview with me about your racing and the MG Special that you're running, but we didn't really cover off a lot about your background in general, other than that you've got multiple hats. Doing a little bit of work still and stuff with the foundation. But I'd like to get a feel of how you got into racing, and then just off mic you were saying you're heading up to Goodwood and bits and pieces, so clearly you've got a passion there. So can you just give a quick brief bio?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for the opportunity to talk again. Yeah, look, I've obviously been a bit of a car tragic for many, many years, since I was in my early teens, starting with Speedway as a bit of a gopher for a friend who lived up the road with a midget speed car, and then sort of progressing a bit into car clubs and sprint racing, hill climbs, those sorts of things when I could. But that got interrupted a bit because I then started working overseas, and in fact most of my working career was outside of Australia. And when I got the opportunity, obviously a bit more money, I decided I'd like to be a bit more serious about it. So I then got into historic racing, which has always interested me. I have a passion for the older cars and the era of the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s, I suppose. And that's really where it went from there. I sort of semi-retired in just before COVID. And then through, I think it was John Myrne introduced me to the AMHF and said, they need some help volunteering. So I went and had a look, and somehow I got talked into this Chief Operating Officer role, which is really a grand title for sort of, conducting the orchestra a little bit, getting things done, and largely administration. But I really enjoy it. It's keeps me very, very busy, and I think we have achieved a few things over the last few years, and a lot more to do.
And it's certainly grown, when I've been talking to other volunteers in this series, It's clearly, there is documentation, video, and all sorts of things coming in the door almost on a daily basis.
Yes.
So more and more people are recognizing the value of retaining documentation about what's gone on in the country. And I've been surprised to hear that some of it goes back to 1904, which is unbelievable, and some of the video back to the 20s,
Yes.
where things have been held by families or by organizations and are now being released. And that, to me, shows that motor racing and the automotive industry in Australia, from its very early days, was a very valuable resource and industry for the country. And so, one of the things that the foundation has done is to work on a study of that over the recent few years, I guess, and you've created an economic value study of the Australia's historical vehicle sector, because that's a natural follow-on. We've lost all of the manufacturing here for
Yes.
cars other than specialist equipment and specialist vehicles. Why did the foundation think that this was a great idea, and how did it get put into practice? Because you can see the natural flow there.
Yes. Yeah, good point. I think, excuse me, Australia has, you're absolutely right, a very rich history of the automotive industry, or motoring in general, going back, and we've got some items here, very treasured items that go back before 1900, and some of those things are just mind-boggling that we've got, and really what I think is not well understood by the general public is just how big the sector is in terms of motoring history and historic vehicles in particular, whether they be cars or motorcycles or trucks or buses or whatever. We soon recognise that if you just take the number of vehicles, we're talking about nearly 1 million historic vehicles of whatever type they are, out of a fleet of maybe 21, 22 million. So it's 4 or 5% of the total number of vehicles in the country. And as we're aware, there are something like 900 registered clubs across Australia, of all different marques of cars and motorcycles and things. And that's just the clubs that are actually registered. There are a lot of other enthusiast groups, and particularly the younger ones these days, are what we call internet clubs. So they don't actually come and meet and, in the traditional style of the older clubs. They actually do it on the internet, and then, guys, let's go out for a coffee on Saturday morning, or see you there, sort of thing. And they're informal, but they're still important and part of that cohort of people that are very passionate about Australian motoring history and the vehicles that they've got. So what we really felt that we need to make all of the stakeholders aware of the size of this, and we obviously the economic value of that to Australia. And we're not talking about car manufacturing and stuff. We're talking about the historic vehicles and what people spend on those vehicles across Australia on an annual basis. So, and it, I'll mention some of the numbers a bit further into the interview, but it's pretty staggering how big the sector is, and I guess it reflects, and it's not too different to the UK situation, which again has a very strong historic motoring sector, and our numbers actually when we did this study actually sort of relatively fit quite well with the findings in the UK as well.
Okay. Yeah.
And there's, it was quite an exciting exercise to do. We decided to do it basically in using 3 stages. Firstly, to try to collect all the data we could, and there's plenty of data out there in terms of the government agencies like Transport for New South Wales here in New South Wales and the equivalent in the other states, in terms of historic vehicles, registered, unregistered, those sorts of things. We also then decided we needed to do a survey, and to conduct a survey like this is no small feat. It's something, to give it credibility, it has to be done professionally, and
Yep.
to that end we engaged an independent consultant to work with us, and we put a survey out to something like the 800 or 900 car clubs
Yeah.
around Australia, and then asked them to distribute that survey
Yes.
to their members.
Yes.
So there are about 25 questions in the survey, and it went to how many vehicles have you got, what age are they, what type of vehicle
Yeah.
they are, how long you've had it, how much do you spend on mechanical repairs, how much you spend on parts annually, fuel, tyres, lubricants. It goes on and on and on, you know, in terms of the breakdown of those costs. So we sent that out, and we had nearly 6,300
Okay.
returns of
Good.
that. So from a sample size, that in terms of, you know, these sorts of studies and that are done looking at economic impact, that is considered quite
Yes.
large,
Okay.
and
Good.
very gives a lot of credibility
Yes.
to the end result of the study. We then, with the help of the independent consultant, we used some modelling of the economy, which then sort of translated some of those, or that data that we've collected, into direct and indirect impacts on the Australian economy.
Mm.
So the end result, just in very broad terms, and we have a very quite a detailed report on this, which is available
Yes.
on our website, and it's also in summary form on the website. But in summary form, we ended up the average spend of respondents was something like $10,300 per annum on their vehicles.
Yes.
And that includes all of those categories I mentioned before, including fuel and things like that, which is, you know, if you look at the other data that we collect nationally on the total vehicle fleet of new cars and non-historical vehicles, it's about 12.5% more than the average person would spend on their car
Okay.
per year. And that probably makes a bit of sense because they are a little bit more expensive to maintain and look after. So we did that, and then, as I say, those costs were broken down into all of these different categories, so we can analyse within the data we collected and how much is spent, you know, on tyres in New South Wales, for instance. You know, so
Okay.
there's quite a
Yeah.
breakdown that is attractive to other stakeholders in
Yes.
the industry. You know, in terms of a business perspective. So if you then multiply the total number of the total spend per year by the number of historic vehicles in Australia, we're talking about $10 billion per annum. And when we released this study back in 2024, interestingly, the budget was released at that point in time, and the Treasurer announced that the surplus for the year was $10 billion, almost the same that our friends and everybody spends on their historic vehicles. So it was just a coincidence, but interesting. So it's a big number, basically.
Yeah.
So then, you know, that's a direct spend. If you then look at the knock-on effects in the economy
Yeah.
of indirect expenditure, and the modelling does this for you. It's a model which is very well known. The government agencies use it, etc. And it's run by Monash University. That knock-on effect effectively doubles that number, you know, to $20+ billion per annum. The other thing we could then do is, using the modelling, we could work out how many people are employed in the sector. And there's something like 42,000 people employed in the sector directly.
Yes.
You know, the guys that fix your car mechanically, do the bodies, motor trimmers, etc. And then another indirect 37,000 people that are in the sort of secondary industries. So that's again, it's a lot of jobs. There's, you know, nearly 80,000 jobs there we're talking about, direct and indirect, and something like $6+ plus $1 billion in wages generated. So, you know, if you look at it overall, it's a very significant part of the economy.
Yeah.
And of course, there's a lot of people involved. If you say there's a million historic vehicles that exist in Australia, then presumably, you know, you're talking about close to 1 million people.
Yes.
And 1 million votes. So it's quite an important, you know, group of people, basically.
It's an interesting study because I mentioned earlier that, you know, Australia's lost its manufacturing of vehicles other than very specialised cars and bits and pieces. You then think about the people that left that industry because they had lost their job with either a manufacturer or a parts supplier, who've then created a company to be able to supply parts or their skills to a group of people who wanted to maintain the cars that originally came out of the factories or came out of factories in the US or Europe. And so, you know, to have a look at the number of jobs, and you're talking about nearly 80,000 jobs just in this one industry alone, direct and indirect, where people are supporting others who are spending that money. And you know, I would, you know, from my experience, I would think that 10,000 a year extra is probably conservative if you've got a classic car, because you know, parts are, as you said, a little bit more expensive. Sometimes they have to be made. What this study has done, certainly for me, is show that this is a hugely important sub-industry for the country. And then if you think back to, you're mentioning the budget, you know, 10 billion surplus in the budget, you know, good Lord, that probably comes from us, from what we're doing, you know, cheekily. But then you think the governments at a federal and a state level should understand that that is a huge amount of money that is circulating in the economy from people who have got a day job, so they're working there. That discretionary spend is being retained in the country and not going overseas to a major corporate like a Microsoft or a Netflix or an Amazon or whatever. It's going straight into somebody's pocket because they've earned it from their daily work, which then goes into the supermarkets.
Or their superannuation fund. Or
everywhere.
Yes, yeah.
But then that money is being spent multiple times in the economy down the line for people to live. Have you had any discussion with state or federal government departments yet about what you've learned in this study?
Well, I guess, you know, the research and the study is the thing, but what are the outcomes from it? And I think certainly when we released the study, you know, it was quite widely publicised and got quite a lot of media attention. We did, via the state councils of motor clubs, yes, the results were distributed to government. The impact of that distribution, we're not quite certain of at the moment. So our next challenge or our next objective is now to really hit home with that information, and also to sort of, you know, refresh the study progressively. You know, maybe do another survey next year or the year after, update all the figures, but make sure it's clearly understood. Not just by the politicians, but by the bureaucrats as well, who set, you know, it can impact on all sorts of things of the future of the classic or historic vehicle sector of, you know, emission controls, you know, registration requirements, all of those sorts of things are things that are potential challenges to the historic vehicle sector downstream, and we need to make sure that this sort of information is out there and people understand it in total. Yes,
because on my mind immediately went to Transport for New South Wales, being you know, in this state, and the way that they're dealing with historic registrations and putting in more and more complex policy and requirements around that. Yet when you think about the impact on the state economy from people running cars, and because there's that 30-year sort of kickoff for a historic car, it means that more and more cars are going to come into that range.
Category, yes.
That means that these numbers will change. They'll get bigger and bigger. And state and federal government need to understand that this is actually very important.
Yeah.
And putting more regulation in could then cause issues with that.
Yeah, I think to be fair, that there's, and I don't know the other states in too much detail, but I know Transport for New South Wales, there's a lot of dialogue with the councils of motor clubs, etc. And I think they're well aware of that. Of course, the rules are a bit different in each state regarding conditional registration, historic registration, etc. What I think is needed going forward, if you go and look at what's happening in the UK, I mean, the UK is a bit different because it's got one total registration agency, the DVLA, where we've got one for every state, basically. So, and they're all a bit different. What's happened in the UK is going forward, they've recognised probably around about 2020 or a bit earlier than that, the need for this sector to be represented with one voice. And not just car clubs, because that's just one part of it. You've got industry, all the suppliers and the workshops and museums and the tourism companies that rely on, motoring related tourism. All of those sorts of things all needs to be represented by, I think by a grouping which is everybody in together, basically. And what's happened in the UK is that the Federation of British Historic Vehicle Clubs has been formed, and they have done similar surveys. In fact, they're about to do another survey, update their data. And they, they're very proactive in terms of engagement with government and regulators, etc. So I think that's where we probably need to go to convert sort of research in terms of studies, etc., into outcomes. And I'm not saying that's not being done. Of course, at a state level, yes, there is quite a bit of dialogue with the regulators. But I think as a grouping nationally, we would be much better placed with a federated group, basically, with everybody involved, and that allows pretty much everything that's done now is done by volunteers, not just the AMHF, but the councils of motor clubs, etc. are all volunteers. Whereas if you have something like what would they have in the UK, that can be funded. You can have administration staff. You're a much stronger organisation.
And it's clear that the industry is very well supported, because if you go to any classic car event, it is always full of people.
Yes.
Everybody wants, and you're right. The knock-on of that, even just catering. People are making a living out of having a coffee cart at a show on a Saturday or a Sunday. All of that builds up into a huge amount of dollars that are being spent for people to enjoy not only their car but also other people's cars as well, and bikes and other bits and pieces. And then, if you add in, the historic racing and other bits and pieces, you could imagine this really becoming a major point for a state or federal government to say, actually, we've got to support this more. Because this is actually now becoming a critical part of our society, where we're saving the skills that we would have been losing because of the fact that there are small organisations employing younger apprentices and people like that to do specific skilled work that is in demand.
Yes.
And so that whole economic value, I think it's going to snowball over the next few years.
Yeah, and we've got to facilitate that.
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
Yeah.
I think everybody has to pitch in and
Yes.
and help
And
basically.
easily.
Yeah.
And I think it's a good idea to have another one in a few years' time, and then so you've got your baseline now
Yep.
on the first one, and then to start looking at it in a slightly different way, because you can start to see the trends of how things are working. But also, if you've got the engagement of different organisations, different levels of government, and everybody is talking the same language, I think for Australia it means that there's a view that this is something that is keeping them going, keeping the country going, but also it's retaining more dollars in the economy. It's not going overseas. It's surely a win-win for everybody.
Absolutely, yeah.
So what's the next steps for this support? You said it's on the website.
Yeah.
So if you go to motorheritage.org.au,
Correct.
you can read it and download it.
Yep.
Are you encouraging car clubs and people to download and to view it and to make some decisions for their own benefit?
Yeah, we see it as a tool for them to use. We're basically doing it to help the sector and particularly the car clubs. So yes, absolutely, and you know we want to keep in constant dialogue with them, and we'll be doing that again very soon as to where we are, what we're doing from an outcomes perspective, you know, in terms of advocacy, etc. And then start to get the industry involved a lot more than they are at the moment, to make sure that we can maybe ultimately in a few years' time head towards the UK model,
Yes.
so that we are quite strong.
Yes.
I think the other thing just quickly to mention too is that we mustn't forget about the actual mental health benefits of this sector. I think that's something you can't put in dollar terms, but if you look at you know, the people involved, the passion for their cars, the way everybody gets together and enjoys their passion, it is a really positive mental health benefit to the country.
Yeah, I think that's a critical point because so many people do forget that, you know, you're active, you're thinking, you're driving. There's so much happiness when you're in the car, and you're focused on something. You're not just sitting there just, you know, switching off. You've actually got a passion and a hobby.
Absolutely.
And I think that if you took in some of the savings in medical bills, because people are active and doing things, you'd find that it was an unbelievable number that you'd come across.
Yes.
And I don't know how you correlate that,
I don't know how you,
but it is, you know, those are the tangible and intangible benefits of doing the survey.
correct.
Yeah.
And if I could just make one final call for volunteers as well for our foundation. We are all volunteers. Please come and join us. We're here on Wednesdays at Sydney Motorsport Park, and there's plenty to do, and you can get involved in all sorts of things. If you want to have a look at our website, and please come and join us.
So motorheritage.org.au is the website. If you have time and you can come in and help out, the lads here would be very happy to see you and to work with you.
Correct. Thanks.
Lovely. Thanks, Geoff.
Thank you.
It was great to catch up with Geoff and learn more about his work with the Foundation. Over time, the Foundation will become a one-stop shop for all things automotive relating to Australia. As discussed with Geoff, the Foundation released their economic value study of the historic vehicle industry, which suggests that owners of older cars contribute over $9 billion annually to the economy, and that's just looking after their vehicles. In reality, this is just scratching the surface of how important the automotive industry still is to the country, despite not having any of the major manufacturers build cars locally. If you would like to volunteer to help the Foundation with their curation of documents, magazines, books and videos, head over to motorheritage.org.au/volunteer and register your interest. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast through your favourite podcast player, and that's Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, Samsung or YouTube, and get the episodes delivered as they're published. Or you can simply subscribe to the website motoringweekly.com.au, and you'll also get notified when a new episode is published. You can listen to all the episodes there or subscribe through a podcast app for simplicity. I'm Stephen Wells, and you've listened to Motoring Weekly, the podcast for the Australian historic road and racing community.